To freedom! Adrien laughed, raising his champagne glass high. The burden is finally gone. Beside him, his mistress stroked the pearls she stole from Zahara, smirking. You upgraded, honey. Even his mother chimed in. She was never one of us. Standing in the rain outside, Zahara didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply opened her laptop and pressed enter. Inside, the music stopped. A single notification flashed on the family accounts. Funds frozen, $36,000. They celebrated erasing her past, unaware she had just deleted their future. But how did a forgotten signature become her ultimate weapon? Subscribe to witness this masterclass in revenge, and tell me in the comments, would you have pushed that button? Let's find out. The air in the VIP conference room of the Manhattan law firm was deliberately kept cold, a sterile chill that seemed to preserve the expensive leather furniture rather than offer comfort to any human occupants. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the city skyline looked like a slab of gray slate under a heavy winter sky, mirroring the lifeless atmosphere inside. Zahara Miles sat perfectly still on her side of the mahogany table, her posture rigid and controlled. She kept her hands folded tightly on her lap, a subconscious gesture meant to protect the slight, tender tension in her lower abdomen that no one else in the room knew about. Across the wide expanse of the table, her husband's family sat like royalty holding court in a dungeon. Hélène Delorme, Adrien's mother, occupied the chair next to her son with a terrifyingly graceful posture. She smoothed a non-existent speck of dust from her silk sleeve, refusing to make eye contact with Zahara. It was a power move Hélène had perfected over 3 years, a subtle way of declaring that Zahara was too insignificant to be acknowledged directly. Adrien, meanwhile, checked his Apple Watch for the 3rd time in a single minute, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. The silence stretched until it became suffocating, broken finally by Hélène's voice, which was soft but carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. I have already spoken to the housekeeper, Zahara, Hélène said, addressing the empty air between them rather than her daughter-in-law. She will pack your belongings into black heavy-duty bags for you. It will be much easier for transport. Hélène paused, a faint poisonous smile touching her lips as she adjusted her pearl earring. I thought it would be best. That way, you won't feel the pressure of trying to fill the Louis Vuitton luggage. You never quite looked right carrying it anyway. It is better to stick to what you are accustomed to. Zahara felt a flare of heat rise in her chest, but she extinguished it instantly before it could reach her face. She tightened her grip on her own fingers under the table until her knuckles turned white, but she kept her chin high. Thank you for your thoughtfulness, Hélène, Zahara said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor she felt inside. But I have my own suitcases. I do not need yours. Adrien groaned audibly, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the crystal water glasses tremble. Drop it, he snapped, looking at Zahara with undisguised irritation. You always have to make everything a production. Just sign the papers. I have a lunch reservation in 20 minutes, and I am not going to miss it because of your pride. Zahara nodded slightly to her lawyer, a signal they had rehearsed. The man in the gray suit slid a thick bound document toward Adrien. Mr. Delorme, the lawyer said, his tone professional and dry. Mrs. Miles requests a final review of Appendix 4B regarding the risk control protocols for joint assets. It is a mandatory procedure before finalization. Adrien looked at the document as if it were a dirty napkin placed on his dinner plate. He picked up his expensive Montblanc pen and spun it between his fingers, a sneer curling his lip. This again? Adrien laughed, a harsh, barking sound that grated against the silence. It is just more of your boring spreadsheets, isn't it, Zahara? Do you still think you are the CFO of this family? We are divorcing because I am tired of you acting like my accountant. Zahara did not blink, locking eyes with the man she had once managed to love. Her voice dropped an octave, becoming slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of the final chance she was offering him. I just want to ensure you know exactly what you are signing, Adrien. Do not say later that I did not warn you. Adrien rolled his eyes, seeking validation from his mother, who merely looked bored. A warning? Are you threatening me now? He shook his head, looking at the dense paragraphs of text with disdain. You can write whatever technical nonsense you want in there. I don't care about your little technical hobbies. Without reading a single word of the text, Adrien flipped to the signature page. He scrawled his name aggressively across the line, the scratching of the pen sounding loud in the silent room. He tossed the pen down as if it were contaminated. "There," he said, leaning back with a smug expression. "Are you happy? Now get out of my life." The lawyer retrieved the document immediately, sliding it into his briefcase before Adrien could change his mind. It was done. The trap was set, and Adrien had walked into it with his eyes wide open, blinded by his own arrogance. Zahara stood up slowly, taking a moment to smooth her skirt. For a split second, her hand rested on her stomach, a protective gesture that went unnoticed by the Delorme. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, replacing the fear that had gripped her for weeks. She was no longer a wife trying to please an ungrateful husband. She was a mother protecting her child from a toxic lineage. "It is finished," Zahara said softly. She gathered her purse, her movements deliberate and dignified. She looked at Adrien one last time, memorizing his arrogant face for the difficult days to come. "Goodbye, Adrien." She turned and walked out of the glass room, leaving the coldness behind her, stepping into the hallway where the air felt just a little bit easier to breathe. The taxi idled at the bottom of the long, winding driveway, its headlights cutting through the misty rain that had begun to fall over the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut. Zahara Miles paid the driver and asked him to wait, her voice calm despite the storm brewing in her stomach. She stared up at the Delorme estate, a sprawling mansion that was currently glowing like a lighthouse in the dark, every window blazing with golden light. She had expected a dark house, perhaps a somber atmosphere, following the finalization of a divorce that ended a 10-year merger of families, but instead she heard the faint, rhythmic thrum of jazz music drifting through the wet air. It seemed the Delormes were not mourning the end of a marriage. They were celebrating a liberation. Zahara tightened her coat around herself, protecting the slight swell of her belly from the damp chill, and walked up the stone steps she had climbed 1,000 times before. She pushed open the heavy oak doors, and the warmth of the foyer hit her instantly, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and roasted canapes. The chatter inside was loud, a cacophony of laughter and clinking crystal, but it died instantly the moment her silhouette appeared in the archway. The jazz band in the corner faltered and stopped, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, faces she recognized. Business partners, distant cousins, socialites, all wearing expressions of pity mixed with cruel amusement. Near the marble fireplace, Camille, the woman who had effectively replaced Zahara long before the papers were signed, stood holding a flute of champagne. She looked radiant and victorious, but Zahara's eyes were drawn immediately to the woman's neck. Camille was wearing the vintage pearl necklace Adrien had given Zahara for their 5th anniversary, a family heirloom that was supposed to be returned to the vault. Camille noticed Zahara's gaze and smiled, a gesture that did not reach her predatory eyes as she reached up to stroke the pearls with exaggerated slowness. "Oh, sorry," Camille said, her voice ringing clear in the silent room, sounding innocent yet laced with venom. "I saw it sitting in the box on the dresser and thought it was just some old junk you left behind, so I decided to try it on." She tilted her head, glancing at Adrien, who stood nearby. "It suits fair skin better, don't you think, honey?" Zahara felt a physical blow to her chest, but she refused to let them see her bleed. She ignored Camille entirely, turning her gaze to Adrien, who looked annoyed that his party had been interrupted. "I am here for my personal items per the legal agreement," Zahara said, her voice steady and loud enough to be heard by the silent crowd. "I will be 5 minutes." She walked past them, her head held high, ascending the grand staircase while the whispers erupted behind her like a hive of agitated bees. In the master bedroom, she found her belongings already shoved into a battered suitcase that sat near the door, packed with careless haste. It was another small indignity, a sign that she had been erased from this space hours ago. She grabbed the handle and turned to leave, but as she reached the bottom of the stairs, Adrien stepped into her path, blocking the exit with his broad frame. "Let me escort you part of the way," Adrien sneered, grabbing the handle of the suitcase from her grip. "You are dirtying my floor with your wet shoes." Hélène Delorme stepped forward from the crowd, sipping her red wine with the casual air of a spectator at a gladiator match. "Adrien, be gentle," she chided softly, though her eyes were cold as ice. Do not let the neighbors think we mistreat the help. None. The guest chuckled softly at the insult, and the sound made Zahara's stomach turn. Adrien yanked the suitcase, forcing Zahara to stumble slightly as she followed him out onto the front porch. The rain had intensified, turning into a cold, driving downpour that soaked Zahara instantly. Adrien dragged the heavy bag to the edge of the stone steps, and with a grunt of exertion, he heaved it into the air. The suitcase tumbled down the stairs, hitting the wet pavement with a sickening crack. The latch, old and strained, burst open upon impact. Zahara's clothes, books, and personal papers spilled out onto the muddy driveway, soaking in the dirty water. Among the scattered items, a small, glossy black and white photo fluttered face up, the ultrasound image she had received just days ago. Panic surged through Zahara, sharper than any insult. She scrambled down the steps, dropping to her knees on the wet asphalt, her hands trembling as she snatched the photo before Adrien or the guests watching from the doorway could see it. She shoved the picture deep inside her coat, pressing it against her heart, shielding the only thing that mattered. Adrien stood at the top of the stairs, sheltered from the rain, looking down at her with a twisted expression of triumph. "Look at you," he laughed, the sound echoing in the night. "Scrabbling in the mud. You are pathetic. Get out of here and don't come back." Zahara did not look up. She gathered her wet clothes with mechanical efficiency, shoving them back into the broken suitcase. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply closed the bag, stood up, and walked to the waiting taxi without looking back at the house that was no longer her home. Once inside the dry, warm interior of the cab, Zahara slumped against the seat, water dripping from her hair onto the leather. The driver looked at her with concern in the rearview mirror, but she waved him off, signaling him to drive. As the mansion faded into the distance, Zahara opened her laptop bag, which she had kept dry. She pulled out her computer, her fingers moving with precision despite the cold that numbed them. She navigated to the secure banking interface of the Delorme Group, a system she had built herself. "You want to erase me?" she whispered to the empty air, her voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Fine, I will erase your arrogance." She typed in the command sequence she had prepared 3 years ago, a failsafe embedded in the financial appendix Adrien had just signed without reading. The screen blinked, processing the request through layers of cybersecurity. Zahara watched the progress bar, her breathing syncing with the blinking cursor. A final prompt appeared. "Execute Miles protocol." She pressed enter with a force that felt like pulling a trigger. The screen flashed a red notification, the color reflecting in her dark eyes. "Access granted. Protocol Miles active. Total assets frozen. $36,400,000. Zahara stared at the number, the vast fortune that was now locked away from the family that had just thrown her into the mud. She did not smile. This was not a victory. It was survival. She closed the laptop, placed a hand over her womb, and watched the rain streak against the window, washing away the past. The transition from the velvet silence of the Connecticut estate to the constant mechanical roar of Queens was jarring enough to leave Zahara dizzy. She sat at a wobbly particle board desk in her new studio apartment, the neon light from a bodega sign across the street flashing rhythmically against her window. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a bed in the desk, but it was hers. There were no servants here to judge her, and no mother-in-law to critique her posture. However, the silence of the room was heavy with a different kind of pressure. She opened her laptop, the screen's blue glow illuminating the dark circles under her eyes, and refreshed her email inbox for the 10th time that hour. It was full, but not with the opportunities she had hoped for. She clicked through the responses from recruitment agencies she had contacted days ago. Her heart sank with every bold regret to inform you that flashed on the screen. She was a qualified financial strategist with a decade of high-level experience, yet door after door was slamming in her face. One email stood out, its honesty brutal and devastating. "We received a negative character reference regarding your tenure at Delorme Group," it read. "We cannot proceed with your application due to concerns over professional integrity." Zahara stared at the words until they blurred. They were not just divorcing her, they were hunting her. They intended to starve her out until she came crawling back to beg for scraps. "They want to corner me," she whispered to the empty room, resting her forehead against the cool laminate of the desk. They want me to break. Hunger eventually forced her out of the apartment. She put on her coat, wrapping it tight against the wind, and walked 2 blocks to the local supermarket. The store was nothing like the gourmet grocers she used to frequent. It was fluorescent lit, smelling faintly of floor wax and overripe fruit, and the linoleum floors were scuffed by years of foot traffic. Zahara walked the aisles carefully, calculating prices in her head, a skill she hadn't needed to use in years. She selected the bare essentials: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some apples, and a box of prenatal vitamins. The total was small, pitifully so, yet her stomach tightened with anxiety as she approached the checkout counter. She placed the items on the conveyor belt and watched the cashier scan them. The beep of the scanner sounded like a countdown. Zahara slid her debit card into the machine, holding her breath. The screen paused, then flashed a harsh message: declined. She felt the blood drain from her face. She tried again, wiping the chip on her sweater, hoping it was just a technical error. But the result was the same. The line of customers behind her shifted restlessly, a chorus of impatient sighs and shuffling feet filling the air. The shame was hot and prickly, crawling up her neck. This was Helene's doing. They had flagged her personal accounts, cutting off her last lifeline. "I am sorry," Zahara stammered, looking at the cashier. "Let me try another card." She knew it would not work, but she had to try something to delay the humiliation. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with bright red hair and a name tag that read Brenda, looked at the error message. Then her gaze dropped to Zahara's open coat, noticing the slight telltale curve of her belly. The woman's expression softened instantly, shifting from boredom to a warm, knowing empathy. "The machines are acting up today, honey," Brenda said loudly, her voice cutting through the grumbling of the customers behind Zahara. "Don't you worry about it." Before Zahara could protest, Brenda swiped her own employee card through the reader. A beep signaled a significant discount applied to the total. Then, with a quick sleight of hand that went unnoticed by the manager in the booth, Brenda grabbed a king-size chocolate bar from the impulse rack and tucked it into Zahara's bag. "Miss, I cannot pay for that," Zahara whispered, her pride warring with her gratitude. She felt exposed, stripped of the armor she usually wore so well. Brenda reached across the scanner and squeezed Zahara's hand. Her skin was rough, but her touch was incredibly warm. "Take it," Brenda said firmly, her eyes locking onto Zahara's. "Do not let the baby go hungry. I raised 3 of them, so I know the look. Everyone falls down sometimes, sweetheart." Zahara tried to hold back, to maintain the stoic mask she had worn in the law office, but the kindness was too unexpected. Tears spilled over, hot and fast, tracking down her cheeks. "I can tell you are a fighter, not a quitter," Brenda added with a wink. "Now go on. Take care of yourself." Zahara nodded, unable to speak. She walked out into the cold night, clutching the plastic bag like a lifeline, the chocolate bar a heavy weight of kindness against her hip. Back in the safety of her studio, she sat on the floor with her back against the radiator. She ate the chocolate slowly, letting the sugar settle her shaking hands. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen, not as a target or a disappointment, but as a human being worthy of help. Her phone buzzed on the floorboards, startling her. The screen displayed an unknown number. She hesitated, fearing it was Adrien or one of his lawyers calling to gloat. But something in her new resolve made her answer. "Mrs. Miles?" a young, sharp voice asked. "This is Leah Duran. You might not remember me, but I was an intern at the firm 2 years ago. You fixed the errors in my final report." Zahara frowned, the name sparking a vague memory of a bright, eager law student who had been too smart for the coffee runs Adrien assigned her. "I remember you, Leah," Zahara said cautiously. "Why are you calling me?" Leah's voice dropped, becoming conspiratorial and intense. "I heard what they are doing to you. I saw the blacklisting emails circling the alumni network. I know you did nothing wrong, Zahara. I want to help you fight them." Zahara sighed, looking around her empty, dim apartment. "I have no money for a lawyer, Leah. They have frozen everything." There was a pause on the line, followed by a dry, confident chuckle that sounded like a closing argument. "This is not about money, Zahara," Leah replied. "It is about the pleasure of seeing Adrien's face when he loses." "I am in." The hallway of the aging apartment building in Queens smelled permanently of floor wax and boiled cabbage, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of the Delorme estate. At 6 in the morning, the silence of the corridor was shattered by a violence that made the dust motes dance in the dim light. Someone was pounding on Zahara's door, the heavy thuds shaking the cheap particle board frame in a rhythm of pure, unadulterated rage. Zahara, who had been awake for hours staring at the cracks in the ceiling, did not jump. She had been expecting this visit ever since she pressed the enter key on her laptop 2 days ago. She slid off the mattress, her movements slow and deliberate, and pulled her robe tighter around her body as a shield against the morning chill. She picked up her phone, tapping the app for the Ring camera she had installed the moment she moved in. The screen illuminated her dark room with a fisheye view of the hallway. Adrien stood there, but he looked nothing like the polished executive who had sneered at her in the law office. His hair was wild and uncombed, his eyes were bloodshot, and his expensive coat was buttoned wrong, suggesting he had dressed in a blind panic. He looked like a man who had not slept, a man who had suddenly found himself falling from a great height with no parachute. Zahara walked to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she undid the deadbolt. She opened the door only 2 inches, allowing the security chain to pull taut, creating a metallic barrier between her sanctuary and his chaos. "Open the hell up!" Adrien screamed the moment he saw her slice of face through the gap. He slammed his palm against the wood, making the chain rattle violently. "Open this door right now, Zahara. What did you do? What the hell did you do to the accounts?" Zahara looked at him, observing the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold draft of the hallway. "Good morning to you too, Adrien," she said, her voice remaining terrifyingly calm amidst his storm. "If you are referring to the freezing of the assets, that is standard procedure. It is the protective protocol under Appendix 4B regarding financial risk during a dispute." "Risk?" Adrien spat the word out, his face contorted. "I was at dinner with the investors. My card was declined, Zahara. Declined. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? My mother is calling me every 5 minutes because her transfers are bouncing." "You signed the document, Adrien," Zahara reminded him, her eyes cold. "It states clearly that in the event of a divorce predicated on behavioral misconduct, the trust administrator, which is me, has the right to freeze assets to protect future interests. You said those technical terms were boring, remember?" Adrien stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the fact that his own laziness had been weaponized against him. The realization seemed to break something inside him, and his anger shifted from financial panic to something darker and more personal. He leaned in closer to the crack in the door, his breath smelling of stale alcohol and desperation. "You think you can play games with me?" he hissed, lowering his voice to a menacing growl. "You think you can starve us out? Listen to me carefully. The private investigator told me everything. He told me you visited the obstetrician." Zahara felt a cold spike of fear pierce her stomach, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She instinctively moved her hand to cover her belly, hidden beneath the thick robe. "That is none of your business," she replied, though her voice lost a fraction of its steel. "It is my business," Adrien shouted, abandoning his whisper. "That child is a Delorme. It carries my blood, and I will not have my heir raised in this rat hole. I will sue you for full custody. I will take that baby, Zahara, and you will never see it again. Do you hear me? That child belongs to the estate." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, Zahara felt small again, back in that glass office, helpless against their money and influence. But then she looked at Adrien, really looked at him, and saw him for what he was, a wounded animal lashing out because he was cornered. "You want to take the child?" Zahara asked, her voice regaining its edge, sharper than before. "And how exactly do you plan to feed him, Adrien? With what money? You cannot even buy yourself a coffee this morning without your mother's credit card, which is currently a worthless piece of plastic." "I will," Adrien stammered, his face turning a shade of purple. "I will break this door down." He threw his shoulder against the wood, the impact straining the screws of the chain lock. Zahara did not flinch. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed a single, steady finger toward the upper corner of the doorframe. "Smile, Adrien," she said, her tone icy. You are on camera." Adrien froze mid-shove. He looked up, his eyes widening as he spotted the small black device with its unblinking red LED light. "That is a cloud-based recording system," Zahara explained, watching the blood drain from his face. "It is live streaming to a secure server. Every threat you just made about kidnapping, every attempt to break into my home, has already been sent to my lawyer in the local police precinct." Adrien stumbled back as if the camera were a gun pointed at his head. He looked from the red light to Zahara's impassive face, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. He was no longer the powerful heir. He was a man caught in the act of violence, stripping himself of any legal high ground he might have claimed. You set me up," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I am giving you 3 seconds to disappear," Zahara said, her hand resting on the door handle, ready to slam it shut. 1. Adrien looked at the camera again, terrified of the silent witness that couldn't be bribed or charmed. He pointed a shaking finger at her, trying to salvage some scrap of dignity. "You will pay for this," he muttered, but the threat lacked any real power. "I have already paid, Adrien," Zahara replied softly. "Now get out." She slammed the door shut and slid the deadbolt home with a decisive click. Through the woods, she heard Adrien's heavy footsteps retreating rapidly down the hallway, fleeing from the truth he couldn't control. Zahara leaned her back against the door, her legs finally giving way as she slid down to the floor. She wrapped her arms around her knees, listening to the silence return to the building, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was the one holding all the power. The fluorescent lights of the district courtroom hummed with a low, headache-inducing vibration that seemed amplified by the sterile whiteness of the walls. Zahara sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded over the slight curve of her belly, watching the proceedings with the stillness of a statue. Beside her, Delorme arranged her files with surgical precision, her young face set in a mask of professional determination that betrayed none of the anger she felt on Zahara's behalf. Across the aisle, the Delorme family presented a tableau of injured nobility. Adrien sat with his head bowed, shoulders slumped in a performance of a broken man, while Hélène dabbed at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, dressed in a shade of charcoal gray that suggested she was mourning the death of decency itself. The Delorme family attorney, a man with silver hair and a voice like oiled velvet, paced in front of the jury box, weaving a narrative that turned reality on its head. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing dramatically towards Zahara, "what we have here is not a simple divorce dispute, but a calculated hostage situation. The defendant, Mrs. Miles, has weaponized her pregnancy and manipulated technical loopholes to extort a grieving family. She is a woman of calculation, not emotion, who saw an opportunity to seize $36 million from the people who welcomed her into their home." Zahara felt the eyes of the jury drift toward her, heavy with judgment, but she did not flinch. She knew the script Hélène had written for this moment. They wanted to paint her as the angry, greedy outsider who had infiltrated their pristine world. Hélène sniffed audibly from the gallery, a sound designed to elicit sympathy, while Adrien kept his gaze fixed on the floor, refusing to look at the woman he had sworn to protect. The lawyer concluded his opening remarks with a flourish, confident that the sheer weight of the Delorme reputation would crush the truth. "Your Honor," Leia said, standing up slowly as the opposing counsel sat down, "we would like to skip the theatrics and present Evidence Exhibit A." She held up a small silver USB drive, the light catching its metal surface. "The plaintiff claims my client is the aggressor. However, technology tells a different story. This is an audio recording recovered from a cloud server, time-stamped to the night Mrs. Miles was removed from the marital home." The judge nodded, and the clerk plugged the drive into the system. For a moment, there was only the hiss of static, followed by the unmistakable heavy sound of rain hitting pavement. Then Hélène's voice cut through the courtroom, amplified by the speakers, stripping away the veneer of the weeping mother sitting in the front row. "Do not forget you are just temporary trash," the recording sneered, the tone dripping with a cold, aristocratic cruelty that made several jurors wince. "Leave the jewelry. It belongs to the family, not to you." The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the recorded sound of Camille's high-pitched, mocking laughter and the violent crash of a suitcase hitting wet concrete. Then came Adrien's voice, clear and dismissive. "Look at you. Pathetic. Get out." When the recording ended, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The atmosphere in the room had shifted violently. The jurors were no longer looking at Zahara with suspicion. They were looking at Hélène and Adrien with undisguised disgust. Hélène stopped dabbing her eyes and turned her face away from the jury, staring rigidly at the wall, her performance shattered by the echo of her own malice. Adrien finally looked up, his face pale, realizing that the privacy he thought his money bought him had been an illusion. "Mrs. Miles, please take the stand," the judge ordered, his voice lacking the patience it had held earlier. Zahara walked to the witness box, her steps steady. She swore to tell the truth, and for the first time, she allowed herself to look directly at the jury. "Mrs. Miles," the judge asked, peering over his glasses, "you heard the accusation that you froze these assets out of greed. What is your response?" Zahara took a deep breath, centering herself. "Your Honor, I did not freeze the funds because I wanted their money. I have never asked for a penny for my own use. I activated the protocol because I know exactly who these people are when the doors are closed." She paused, her gaze drifting briefly to Adrien, who shrank in his seat. "If that money remains in their hands, my son will become a tool to them, just another asset to be managed or discarded." I saw what their influence did to Adrien, how it stripped him of his spine and his morals. I do not need their money, but I need the power to keep my son safe from that toxicity. I am not fighting for a payout. I am fighting for his future. Her voice did not waver, and the raw honesty of her words seemed to physically push back against the lies that had filled the room earlier. There were no theatrics, no fake tears, just the fierce, quiet protection of a mother. The judge looked at her for a long moment, then turned his gaze to the defense table, where the high-priced lawyer was now frantically shuffling papers, knowing he had lost the room. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. Based on the irrefutable evidence of emotional abuse and the hostile environment demonstrated by the plaintiff's own family, the judge announced, his tone leaving no room for argument, this court rules that full physical and legal custody is awarded to the mother, Zahara Miles. Furthermore, the frozen assets totaling $36 million will be transferred immediately into an irrevocable trust for the child, with Mrs. Miles appointed as the sole trustee until the child reaches the age of majority. The plaintiff is responsible for all legal fees incurred. The verdict landed like a physical blow. Adrien slumped forward until his forehead hit the mahogany table, the reality of his total defeat crushing him. He had lost his wife, his son, and control of the fortune he defined himself by. In the gallery, Hélène stood up abruptly, her face a mask of cold fury. She grabbed her Hermes bag and turned to leave, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Mother?" Adrien called out, reaching a hand toward her as he scrambled to stand up. "Mother, wait!" Hélène paused, looking at her son's outstretched hand with the same disdain she had once reserved for Zahara. She did not take it. "You have embarrassed the family, Adrien," she hissed loud enough for the back row to hear. "Do not touch me." She walked out of the courtroom without looking back, leaving Adrien standing alone in the aisle, abandoned by the only power structure he had ever trusted. Zahara watched them crumble from the witness stand, feeling a profound sense of lightness. The chains were broken. She stepped down from the stand, nodded to Leia, and walked out of the double doors, leaving the wreckage of the Delorme legacy behind her. The golden light of the late afternoon sun bathed the manicured lawns of the estate in a warm, amber glow, transforming the imposing stone facade of the mansion into something almost welcoming. It had been exactly 1 year since the night of the rainstorm, the night Zahara had been thrown out onto these very steps like unwanted refuse. Today, however, the iron gate stood wide open, adorned with a banner that read, "The Miles Renard Center for Single Mothers." The oppressive silence that used to hang over the Delorme property had been replaced by the gentle hum of conversation and the soft clinking of silverware as donors and guests mingled in the garden. Zahara moved through the crowd with an easy grace, the silk of her navy blue dress flowing around her legs. She held her 6-month-old son, Miles, against her hip, his small hand gripping the fabric of her shoulder. He was a happy, observant child, with bright eyes that took in the world with curiosity rather than fear. Zahara paused near the fountain, which was now bubbling with clear water instead of the stagnant silence of the past. Mr. Renard, the philanthropist who had purchased the foreclosed property and partnered with Zahara's trust, approached her with a beaming smile. "You have done something remarkable here, Zahara," Mr. Renard said, taking her hand in both of his. He looked around at the gathering, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "You turned a monument to vanity into a sanctuary. This house finally has a soul because of you." "It wasn't just me, Mr. Renard," Zahara replied, shifting Miles to her other hip. "I just provided the resources. You provided the vision. You provided the justice," he corrected her gently, "and that is a rare thing these days." Mr. Renard excused himself to greet the mayor, leaving Zahara alone for a moment. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of blooming jasmine. She felt light, unburdened by the heavy armor she had been forced to wear for so long. She was no longer the silent wife in the corner or the defendant in the courtroom. She was the architect of her own life. A shadow fell across her path, and a waiter appeared at her elbow, holding a silver tray of sparkling water. The tray was shaking slightly, the glasses chiming against each other in a nervous rhythm. Zahara turned to politely decline, but the words died in her throat. The man holding the tray was wearing a uniform that was a size too small, the cheap polyester straining at the shoulders. His face was gaunt, lines of stress and exhaustion etched deep around his mouth, aging him 10 years in just one. It was Adrien. He froze when he realized who he was serving. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting his own former life. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The dynamic of the past had been completely inverted. Zahara stood tall and radiant, holding the future in her arms, while Adrien stood bowed and servile, holding a tray of drinks for guests in a house he used to own. "Zahara," Adrien whispered, his voice cracking. He looked at her as if he were seeing the sun after years in a cave. "Hello, Adrien," Zahara said. Her voice was calm, devoid of the anger or fear that had once defined their interactions. It was the indifference of a stranger. Adrien's gaze drifted down to the baby. His eyes locked onto Miles, and a look of profound, agonizing longing washed over his features. The baby looked back at him with solemn, dark eyes, recognizing nothing but a face among many. Adrien's hands trembled harder, and he had to lower the tray to a nearby table to stop the glasses from spilling. He looks so much like I did when I was small," Adrien stammered, his voice thick with unshed tears. He took a hesitant step forward, his posture pleading. I am so sorry, Zahara. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. I lost my way." Zahara watched him, feeling a flicker of pity. He was not a monster anymore. He was just a broken man who had believed his own hype until it destroyed him. "I know you are sorry, Adrien," she said softly. "I accepted that a long time ago. It was the only way I could sleep at night." "Can I?" Adrien reached out a hand, his fingers hovering inches from the baby's foot, desperate for a connection. "Just for a moment? Can I touch him? Please." Zahara did not flinch, but she did not move forward. She took a small, deliberate step back, increasing the distance between them. It was a subtle movement, but it carried the weight of a canyon. She pulled the blanket tighter around Miles, shielding him. "Not today, Adrien," she said firmly, "and not tomorrow." Adrien pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He looked at her with utter despair. "Then what do I have to do? Tell me. I will do anything." "You have to change," Zahara said, her voice steady and clear. "You have to become a man that my son would not be ashamed to know. You have to learn how to exist in this world without a safety net and without looking down on people who serve you." Adrien looked down at his cheap uniform, the irony settling on him like a heavy coat. He nodded slowly, accepting the judgment. "When you have done that," Zahara continued, "call my lawyer. We will see." She did not wait for his response. There was nothing left to say. Zahara turned away from him, shifting Miles so he could see the vibrant colors of the garden. She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking rhythmically on the stone path. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of purple and gold, casting long shadows behind her. She did not look back at the man standing by the table, nor at the mansion that had once been her prison. "Let's go, son," she whispered, kissing the top of the baby's head. "We are free." As she stepped through the open gates and into the waiting car, the screen faded to black, leaving only a final line of text lingering in the darkness. "The best revenge is massive success." Zahara's journey proves that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply signs a document and waits. What did you think of her final decision at the gala? Did Adrien deserve a moment with his son, or was Zahara right to keep walking? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Thank you for listening and living this story with me. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption. Until next time, take care.